Among the works we're showing are a suite of 13 photographs by Sherry Levine after Rodchenko, negative. These are photographs dating from 1987. It's actually the first time that they've been exhibited. They are an example of her appropriation work, appropriation art in photography. She has retaken photographs by Alexander Rodchenko, iconic images, which she then prints in negative. So she's doing sort of two interventions, one where she's mediating Rodchenko's work, and the second where she's actually transforming the image from the positive to the negative. You know, it's a very simple gesture and yet very impactful. Sherry began making appropriative work in the late 1970s. Her earliest photographic appropriations were after Walker Evans, after Edwin Weston, also after Rodchenko. You know, she was very strategic and sort of surgical in her selection of imagery, and also the artists whom she used for source material, often sort of modern masters. You know, she was certainly calling up issues and questioning issues of originality, authorship, the artist's sort of process, in a very radical way, in fact, you know, without apology, saying, I can take this and make it my own. You know, those are, of course, Rodchenko's images. Those are images that she culled from source material on Rodchenko, often actually monographs of his work. So part of what she does is kind of curating the image selection so that she is, one, identifying sort of recognizable Rodchenko images, but also putting them together in a way that creates a work of hers as well. So it's the sort of selection, it's the transformation, and then it's also the kind of curation of the work. Some of them, for instance, are simply portraits. Others are taken from everyday life. For instance, there's a female diver. It shows her doing a backflip from above, and of course the orientation of the images is disorienting. But they're really, you know, images that are sort of well known as Rodchenko's kind of iconic, I would say 1920s, turn of the 20th century photographs. You know, I think Sherry's interest in Rodchenko is also somewhat, you know, her interest in that period of the 20th century when artists were, the avant-garde was really coming to the fore, and Rodchenko was certainly a leader of that.
In the year 1898, F. Holland was one of the leaders of the photo-secessionist movement, and he, along with others, were out to demonstrate that photography was an equal art form to painting and sculpture. It was during this time when F. Holland created what is considered one of the great icons of the history of the medium, F. Holland's 7 words. In this image, Day has, in essence, starved himself or emaciated himself, and he imported a crown of thorns from the Middle East and posed as Christ on the cross. In this piece there are 7 images that depict Christ during those last moments, otherwise known as his 7 words. Many of the artists during the movement were looking at ways to compete with painting. And one way would be to look, you know, for softer focus, for different chemical processes that gave the photographs a painterly effect or elements of color. So these fit very well within the period. This piece was entered into the Philadelphia Salon in 1898 with the help of Alfred Stieglitz, who was also leading the movement. And at that time, it created a huge public outcry. How dare man depict himself as Christ? And Day's point was, if one can do it in painting and sculpture, why can't it be done in photography? Soon after, Day and Stieglitz would end up in a bit of a battle for who would run the future of the photosecessionist movement. And in essence, Stieglitz won, and soon after moved the medium into a more pure photographic form, focusing, which would later become modernism. And at that time, Day's home burned down, many of his negatives and prints were lost, and he became a forgotten figure. It wasn't until the 1970s when a couple were moving into a small home in Philadelphia that they discovered, leaning up against the trash from the previous owners, a photograph, and they brought this photograph to Sotheby's, and where it was put up at auction, and it would become the most expensive photograph ever sold. And it was at that time people began to re-examine and look at the influence of Day. So many artists came from that lineage. And roughly 5-7 years ago, there was a show at the Whitney Museum of Art where it was called Photography in the Self, The Legacy of F. Holland Day, where this piece was placed in the center of the show, and surrounding it were images by Sherman and Mapplethorpe and Lucas Samaras and many of the others that clearly were influenced by Day. The fact that he was quite famous during the time. He was an important literary figure. He was friends with Oscar Wilde, and he was quite flamboyant. That contributed to the furor over the artist and the work. What's so important about this piece is it looks at performance. It was very much ahead of its time, 100 years ahead of its time.
He was a German photographer. He was born at the end of the 19th century in 1898. He was born in Germany, but the family relocated to Argentina for the majority of his childhood. And he returned to Berlin as a teenager, where he began his artistic studies, which were then promptly interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War. He was conscripted and he fought in the First World War and resumed his studies afterwards again. He is interested in abstraction, in surrealism and photography. He's very much preoccupied with the materiality of the photograph and the processes and craft involved in darkroom photography. So he manipulates his photographs, he creates collages and montages and moves images towards abstraction through lighting and manipulation of the surface of his negatives. He would work into his negatives, so he would coat them with resins and paints and then scratch into the surface. He worked a lot with photograms. He was a contemporary of Man Ray. Man Ray was born 8 years before him, so both artists worked with photograms, and he used multiple exposures, so he would stack his negatives and expose multiple images onto a single surface. Through manipulation of the darkroom process, he creates images that look like painting or almost like collagraphs or etchings. Hajek-Halke was particularly interested in the female form, that's a recurring theme, and also surrealism and surrealist landscapes, and he often combined the two, so images of women's bodies are overlaid with crowd scenes and abstracted images. He did fight during the war. He returned to his studies afterwards and was actually asked by the Nazi regime to falsify documentary film. He refused and fled to Switzerland, where he concentrated on scientific photography. There's certainly an ambiguity within his images. His images are very beautiful. They're decorative, but they're also challenging. Your eye is forced to work out what's going on. So what at first glance seems a more simplistic image, when you look into it, it becomes much more interesting. He worked in the Weimar period and was creating images that were perhaps unexpected given the sort of context and the surrounding political situation that he was working within. He worked in Berlin.
Lionel Wendt may not sound like very much of an Indian name. In fact, he is a Sri Lankan artist or a Ceylonese artist who was active as an artist between the 30s and the 40s. He had a very broad range of subject matter that he addressed. So he worked on the Sri Lankan landscape, just the daily life of ordinary Sri Lankans, farmers, coconut sellers, and also was especially interested in dance and music, and so he did several photographs of traditional Kandyan dancers and musicians. He was clearly very aware of what was, the current artistic currents in other parts of the world, in Europe and America, and had clearly looked at works of other artists such as Man Ray. So he was experimenting also with the photographic technique. So he worked on photo montage, solarizations, things that he actually was discovering himself in the darkroom, which is really fascinating for that time period. I'd say that he was also very involved, as I said, with the theatre, not only classical but also contemporary. So he took portraits of artists, of actresses, singers, musicians, other performers who were part of his artistic circle. He was clearly aware of kind of Hollywood photography from the 30s and 40s, and you can see that in a lot of the images. They're very staged, they're incredibly cinematic in some ways. He was also looking at old master painting at the time. You've got photographs where he's got young Sri Lankans dressed and posing in a portrait after Titian, for example. And you've got a composition after the Kurcfeld. His treatment of the Sri Lankan male body was really particular for that moment in time, and his approach to the male body. What's also interesting is that on his death, all his negatives were destroyed by a friend of his. And there is some talk that that was the accepted practice at the time, but it is also possible that his subject matter could possibly have been something of concern. They were extremely homoerotic, but in a very, very gentle and lyrical and very South Asian way, not in any kind of very obvious way that we've become familiar with in photography today, for example.